My high school best friend turned competitive and jealous. I slowly ended up alone and I don't know what to do. I met Emma in our very first year of high school, on one of those days that feels insignificant at the time but ends up changing the course of your life. We were both new, both nervous, both pretending we weren't. I remember walking into chemistry class, scanning the room for an empty seat, and seeing her already settled near the window with her notebook perfectly aligned on the desk. She looked up, smiled, and gestured toward the chair next to her like it was the most natural thing in the world. That was it. That was how it started. I bonded with Emma quickly, mostly because we were wired in similar ways, or at least, that's what I believed back then. We both loved science, not just in the, this will help us get good grades, way, but in the genuine curiosity kind of way. We'd stay after class asking teachers questions, arguing over which experiments were more interesting, and joking about how everyone else thought we were too serious for our age. Studying together became routine almost immediately. We'd sit in the library for hours, trading notes, explaining concepts to each other, pushing each other to understand things properly instead of memorizing them. When one of us struggled, the other would step in. It felt balanced, supportive, like teamwork, and when studying got overwhelming, we had the same way of unwinding. We'd go on long walks after school, usually without much of a plan. Sometimes around the neighborhood, sometimes through nearby parks. We talked about everything: teachers we liked, classes we hated, what we wanted to do in the future. Other times, we'd just walk in silence, letting the noise in our heads settle. Those walks became our thing. If one of us had a bad exam or a stressful week, we'd text each other something simple like, "Park." And that was enough. We'd sit on a bench, watch people pass by, complain about life, and leave feeling lighter. At school, people started grouping me and Emma together automatically. If you saw one of us, the other was usually nearby. Teachers paired us up for projects without asking. Classmates referred to us as if we were a unit. At the time, I took all of that as proof that we were real friends. Looking back, I realize I was the only one who saw it that way so purely. Back then, I thought we were equals, two girls who met by chance, shared the same interests, and pushed each other forward. I thought we were growing together. I didn't notice the small pauses when I did well, the subtle tight smiles when a teacher praised me, or how encouragement sometimes sounded just a little forced. I didn't notice any of it. I was just happy to have found someone who felt like my person in a new, overwhelming place. At first, nothing changed in any obvious way. We were still studying together, still sitting side by side in class, still taking those after-school walks like we always had. If someone asked me back then whether anything felt off, I would have said no without hesitation. But small things started happening, things I brushed off because they seemed too minor to matter. It started with grades. Whenever we got results back, we'd lean toward each other, scanning the papers before anyone else could see. If Emma did well, I celebrated her without thinking. I'd grin, whisper congratulations, squeeze her arm under the desk. When I did well, Emma's reactions were different. Not negative, just delayed. She'd glance at my paper, then back at her own, and say something like, "Oh, you did really well," in a tone that sounded more surprised than happy. Sometimes she'd follow it with, "I don't know how you remembered that part," or, "I guess the teacher just likes how you explain things." I told myself I was overthinking it. Then came the comparisons. Emma started asking questions that felt innocent on the surface: how long I studied, whether I'd revised a certain chapter, what resources I used. At first, I answered freely. We had always shared everything. But slowly, I noticed that whenever my answers sounded easier than hers, I just went over the notes, or, it clicked this time, her mood would shift. Not dramatically, just enough to make the air feel heavier. Group projects changed too. Teachers loved pairing us together because we worked efficiently. But I started noticing how she'd subtly position herself as the leader when others were around. She'd present ideas as ours when they succeeded, but if something didn't land well, it somehow became mine. If a teacher praised our work, she'd quickly jump in to explain the hardest parts, especially the parts one had worked on. I didn't correct her. I didn't want to seem petty. After all, we were friends. But the biggest change came during conversations about the future. We used to talk excitedly about university, careers, and dreams like they were shared goals. Somewhere along the way, those conversations turned sharper. If I mentioned a program I was interested in, she'd immediately start listing its downsides. If a teacher suggested I apply for something competitive, she'd laugh it off and say things like, "They say that to everyone." And yet, when similar opportunities came up for her, she spoke about them with certainty, like they were already hers. Still, I ignored the warning signs. I told myself that stress makes people weird. That ambition can come out sideways. That close friendships naturally shift when pressure increases. I didn't realize that what I thought was mutual motivation had quietly become a comparison. That what I saw as encouragement had started to feel like measurement. And that somewhere along the line, success stopped being something we shared, and started being something counted. I didn't see it as rivalry yet, but for the first time, I felt something I couldn't name when I did well. Not pride, not guilt, just the uneasy sense that my achievements were no longer welcome in the space we shared. A few days ago, something happened that I can't stop thinking about, not because it was extreme, but because of how unnecessary it was. That morning at school, I saw Emma in the hallway between classes. It was crowded and loud, and I was half distracted, already thinking about the lab we had coming up. When I reached her, I smiled, said hi, and gave her a quick pat on the back. It was probably a little firmer than usual, just an awkward, rushed gesture more than anything else. I didn't think twice about it. But throughout the rest of the day, Emma did the same thing back to me. Over and over. The first time, I brushed it off. We crossed paths after second period, and she greeted me with a noticeably hard pat between my shoulder blades. It caught me off guard, but I laughed it off, assuming she was just being playful. The second time was during lunch. I was sitting with a group of classmates, when she came up behind me and did it again, harder this time. Enough that one of the girls at the table glanced at me, eyebrows raised. I forced a smile. By the third time, later that afternoon, it didn't feel accidental anymore. We were alone in the hallway, lockers mostly cleared out, and when she saw me, she did it again. Same spot, same force. Emma smiled while she did it, like nothing was unusual, like this was just how friends greeted each other. But it didn't feel friendly. It felt pointed. I remember standing there afterward, rubbing my shoulder, trying to tell myself I was being ridiculous. That I was reading into something that wasn't there. That maybe she was just mirroring what I'd done earlier. But the difference was intent. Mine had been thoughtless. Hers felt deliberate. What bothered me most wasn't the physical sensation. It was the way it made me feel small and unsettled, like she was testing something. Pushing a boundary without saying a word. Making sure I noticed, while leaving just enough deniability that I'd sound crazy if I called it out. I didn't say anything that day. I told myself it wasn't worth starting drama over something so minor. That real friends don't keep score over gestures. Still, as I walked home that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted again, this time in a way that wasn't just emotional or academic. For the first time, her competitiveness didn't just feel internal. It felt directed at me. After that day, her words started changing. Not all at once, not in a way that was obvious enough to point to a single moment and say, this is when it started. It was more like a slow drip. Small remarks that, on their own, sounded harmless, but together began to form a pattern I couldn't ignore. It started with studying. If I mentioned I understood a topic, she'd smile and say things like, must be nice to just get it without trying, or, some of us actually have to work for our grades. She always said it lightly, almost joking, but the tone lingered just long enough to sting. When we studied together, she'd quiz me in this overly formal way, like she was trying to catch me out. If I answered correctly, she'd nod and say, okay, guess that makes sense, like she was reluctantly approving something unfair. If I made even a small mistake, though, she jumped on it. See, that's what I mean, she'd say. You're not actually that strong in this topic. Grades made it worse. Whenever results came back, she'd immediately ask what I got. If my score was higher, her face would tighten for just a second before she recovered. Wow, she'd say, I didn't expect that, or worse. You probably just answered in the way the teacher likes. When her grades were better, she made sure to mention them, casually, but repeatedly. She'd bring them up in group conversations, in front of classmates, even in front of teachers. I was surprised I did that well, she'd say, glancing at me. I guess some of us are more consistent. It wasn't just academics anymore. Emma started making little comments about everything, how teachers treated me, how classmates reacted to me, even how I spoke in class. If a teacher complimented my explanation, she'd later say, you talk with so much confidence. Even when you're wrong, people believe you. If classmates asked me for help, she'd laugh and say, they always come to you first. You're good at making it look easy. What hurt the most was how she framed everything as a flaw disguised as praise. Like my success wasn't earned, just handed to me. Like my confidence wasn't confidence, just arrogance that people mistook for intelligence. I started dreading conversations about school with her. I found myself downplaying my achievements, softening my language, saying things like, I got lucky, or, it was probably an easy test, just to avoid the tension. I hated that about myself, that I was shrinking to keep her comfortable. And yet, when I struggled, she didn't step in the way she used to. If I mentioned feeling stressed, she'd say, well, at least you're naturally smart. You'll be fine. There was no comfort in that. Just distance. I kept wondering whether I was imagining things, whether stress had changed both of us, whether this was just what growing up looked like. But deep down, I knew something had gone wrong. Friends are supposed to celebrate each other. She was starting to sound like someone keeping score. And I was starting to feel like I was losing, no matter what I did. I think what finally made it impossible to ignore wasn't something she said to me directly. It was the way other people started reacting. The first time, it happened during a group study session after school. There were 4 of us sitting around a table, books spread out, half focused and half exhausted. I explained a concept someone had asked about, and before I could finish, she cut in. That's not really how I'd explain it, she said, correcting me in front of everyone. I stopped talking, confused, because what I'd said wasn't wrong. One of the guys at the table glanced between us awkwardly. Another girl quietly said, that's basically the same thing she just said. There was an uncomfortable pause. Later, when she went to grab a book from another table, that same girl leaned toward me and whispered, hey, are you guys okay? I laughed it off instinctively. Yeah, why? She hesitated. I don't know. Emma just seems tense with you. I told her everything was fine, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. The second time was with a teacher. After class, our physics teacher pulled me aside and asked if everything was going okay in our study group. The teacher said she'd noticed a shift in dynamics, that there seemed to be unnecessary tension during discussions. I felt my face burn. I defended her immediately. I said we were both stressed, that exam season was getting to us. The teacher nodded, but her expression said she wasn't entirely convinced. Then came the comments from friends. People started sitting slightly farther apart from us at lunch. Conversations that used to flow easily would stall when we both spoke. Someone once joked, you two sound like rivals, not friends, and then immediately backtracked when the laughter didn't land. Even my parents noticed. One evening, after I came home quiet and distracted, my mom asked if something was wrong between me and her. My mom said I seemed tense whenever I mentioned school, especially when I mentioned Emma's name. That's when it hit me hardest. I wasn't imagining it, I wasn't being overly sensitive. And it wasn't just between us anymore. Whatever was happening had spilled out into the open, visible enough that people who barely knew us could feel it. And yet, no one knew how to address it, including me. I felt stuck between 2 impossible choices. Say something and risk confirming that our friendship was broken. Or stay silent and keep absorbing the discomfort, hoping it would somehow pass. But the looks people gave me, the concerned questions, the careful distance, made one thing painfully clear. Something was wrong. And pretending otherwise was starting to hurt more than facing it. Today, I finally decided I couldn't keep carrying this by myself. I woke up with that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that shows up when you know a conversation is coming, whether you want it or not. I replayed everything in my head. The comments, the looks, the moments that made me doubt myself. I kept asking whether I was being unfair, whether stress had just changed her temporarily. But the truth was, nothing was improving. So after school, when most people had cleared out, I asked Emma if we could talk. She looked surprised, then immediately guarded, like she already sensed where this was going. We sat on one of the benches near the science building, the same place we used to sit during our walks when everything felt easy. I tried to stay calm. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I told her how I'd been feeling instead. I told her that her mood swings were confusing and exhausting. That some days she was supportive, and other days she felt cold, distant, or sharp for no clear reason. I mentioned the passive-aggressive comments about studying, grades, and how I just get things. I brought up how often I felt put down right after doing well. I even mentioned the physical stuff, the repeated hard pats on the back, and how it made me uncomfortable. I told her I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, unsure of which version of her I'd get. That I missed feeling like we were on the same team. Emma didn't say anything at first. She stared at the ground, arms crossed, jaw tight. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd even respond. Then she sighed and said, "You're reading way too much into everything." She told me she was stressed. That school was hard. That I was lucky, because things seemed to come more easily to me. She said I'd changed too, that I'd become distant, overly sensitive, and self-centered. When I tried to explain that stress doesn't excuse hurting someone, she laughed, and said, "Wow. So now I'm the bad guy." That was the moment something shifted in me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was tired. I told her I wasn't trying to accuse her. I just wanted honesty. I wanted to know whether something had changed between us, and if so, why she couldn't just talk to me instead of taking it out on me. She shrugged and said, "Maybe we're just not as similar as you think anymore." That hurt more than any insult. Because it confirmed what I'd been slowly realizing. She didn't want to fix this. She wanted to dismiss it. I left that bench knowing I'd finally spoken up, but also knowing that confrontation doesn't always lead to resolution. Sometimes, it just makes the distance undeniable. I thought confronting her would clear the air. I was wrong. After that conversation, Emma didn't explode or start drama. She did something worse. She went cold. At school, she stopped sitting next to me unless there was no other option. When I spoke in class, she wouldn't look at me. When I asked her something directly, she'd respond with one-word answers, like she was tolerating me rather than talking to me. But the passive aggression didn't stop. It just changed form. Instead of direct comments, she started making pointed remarks to other people, loud enough for me to hear, subtle enough that I couldn't call them out without sounding paranoid. During a study session, she said, "Some people rely too much on natural ability instead of actually putting in effort," while looking straight past me. Another time, she joked about how confidence can be mistaken for competence, and laughed when a few people awkwardly smiled. She also started correcting me constantly in public. Even over tiny things. Even when I wasn't wrong. If I explained something in class, she'd jump in with a slightly reworded version, like she needed to override my voice. If a teacher asked me a question and I answered, she'd mutter under her breath or roll her eyes. Once, during a lab, she yanked a worksheet out of my hands and said, "I'll do it. This needs to be done properly." I froze. People noticed. Again, a classmate pulled me aside afterward and said, "She didn't have to do that." Another asked me if we'd had a fight. Even our teacher asked whether we wanted to switch lab partners for a while. That suggestion felt like both a relief and a defeat. What hurt the most was how deliberate it all felt. This wasn't stress anymore. This wasn't misunderstanding. It felt like punishment. Like I'd broken an unspoken rule by calling her out, and now she was making sure I paid for it. I caught myself replaying the confrontation over and over, wondering if I'd said something wrong, if I should have worded things differently. But deep down, I knew this reaction had nothing to do with how I approached it. She didn't want accountability. She wanted control, and the more I tried to protect my peace, the more she seemed determined to disturb it. By the end of the week, I was exhausted, not from studying, not from exams, but from the constant tension of sharing space with someone who used to feel safe. I started avoiding her, and that was the moment I finally admitted something I'd been ignoring for a long time. This friendship wasn't just strained. It was becoming harmful. After weeks of walking on eggshells, I realized something uncomfortable but necessary. If I didn't set boundaries, Emma would keep pushing. So I stopped shrinking. The change wasn't loud or obvious. I didn't confront her again. I didn't argue or explain myself. I just stopped allowing certain things. The first time Emma corrected me unnecessarily in class, I didn't laugh it off or go quiet like I usually did. I calmly said, "That's actually what I was saying," and continued talking. She blinked, clearly not expecting it. When she grabbed my paper during a lab and started redoing my work, I took it back and said, "I've got it. You can work on your part." My voice didn't shake this time. She went silent. The air around us felt tight. I stopped over-explaining myself. If she made a passive-aggressive comment, I didn't rush to defend myself. I'd just say, "Okay," or, "That's your opinion," and move on. The biggest boundary was emotional. I stopped sharing my stress, my worries, my study plans. The late walks and park talks faded into distance. I still treated her politely, but I no longer offered pieces of myself she had learned how to use against me. She didn't like that. I could see it in how she watched me when I talked to other classmates. In how she suddenly became louder when I answered questions. In how she'd make comments like, "Wow, you've changed," with that same sharp smile. But I didn't apologize. For the first time, I realized boundaries don't need permission. They don't need to be dramatic or justified. They're simply lines you stop letting people cross. And even though setting them made things awkward, uncomfortable, and lonely at times, it also made something else happen. I started feeling lighter, like I was finally standing on my own side. I didn't know where this friendship was headed anymore, or if it would survive at all. But I did know one thing with certainty. I was done letting someone else's insecurity dictate how small I made myself. And whatever happened next, I was ready to face it without backing down. Once I stopped pouring so much of my attention into her, there was suddenly space. At first, that space felt strange, almost uncomfortable. I was so used to navigating her moods, watching my words, measuring my reactions, that being around people who didn't require that felt unfamiliar. But then something unexpected happened. Other friendships started filling that gap. It wasn't dramatic or intentional. It began with small moments. Studying with classmates I'd usually only spoken to in passing, sitting with different people during breaks, having conversations that didn't revolve around competition or comparison. And the difference was jarring. No one made subtle digs about my grades. No one corrected me just to feel superior. When I talked about being tired or stressed, people listened instead of turning it into a contest. One afternoon, while studying with a group, I answered a question and someone said, "Oh, that actually makes sense. Thanks." That was it. No edge, no follow-up comment to undermine me. I remember feeling oddly emotional over something so small. Another time, I mentioned I was nervous about an upcoming exam, and instead of being met with smug reassurance or judgment, someone offered to revise together. Just like that, no strings attached. Slowly, I realized how tense I had been for months. These friendships felt lighter, safer. I didn't feel the need to perform or prove myself. I could make mistakes without feeling like they'd be mentally cataloged and used against me later. Meanwhile, Emma noticed. She'd glance over when she saw me laughing with others. She'd insert herself into conversations she'd never shown interest in before. Sometimes she'd make comments like, "I guess you've found new people now," said half jokingly, half bitter. I didn't engage. For the first time, I understood something important. Supportive friendships don't drain you, they steady you. Being around people who didn't see me as competition reminded me of who I was before I started doubting myself. I wasn't arrogant. I wasn't lazy. I wasn't imagining things. I had just been shrinking to make someone else feel bigger. Finding support elsewhere didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like balance. And deep down, I knew this was the beginning of a shift I couldn't undo, even if I wanted to. Looking back now, it's almost hard to believe how tense everything had been. The constant competition, the mood swings, the passive-aggressive comments, they feel distant, like they belong to someone else's life. Since I set boundaries and allowed myself to connect with others, life became lighter. I still see her at school, but her words no longer have the power to shake me. I've learned to recognize when someone's behavior isn't about me, it's about them, and that insight has been freeing. My friendships with others have grown stronger, more genuine. I study without feeling judged, laugh without second-guessing, and even share my stress openly without fear of it being turned into a competition. Those small moments of support have reminded me how good it feels to be seen for who I am, not measured against someone else. It hasn't been about winning or being better. It's been about reclaiming my own space and peace. And in doing so, I've realized that real friendships don't drain you, they lift you up. Today, everything feels more balanced, more manageable, and more joyful. I'm no longer walking on eggshells or shrinking to fit someone else's insecurities. I'm finally free to be myself, and that alone makes everything better.